You remember the song Imagine? I want you to imagine something today. You can't make a telephone call. You can't have power in your house. No lights, no heat. You can't buy groceries. Your car doesn't start. You are faced with a hideous blackout. Is America destined for a dark new age? North Korea now has a super weapon that could annihilate our electric grid, crippling our whole country. Hackers are just keystrokes away from plunging our cities into darkness. And catastrophic solar storms could fry our nation's power supply. So how can we as a nation stop this doomsday nightmare? George Thomas has an explanation.
From natural phenomena to cyber hacks, like the massive SolarWinds operation and recent attack to the Colonial gas pipeline, security experts warn it's clear that most businesses and key infrastructure, like power grids across this country, are woefully unprepared to meet such threats.
They went after our gas and they went after our hot dogs. No one is out of bounds here. Everyone is in play.
Lawmakers like Senator Bob Hall of Texas also worry that means hackers could be just a few keystrokes away from turning the lights out in cities around our country.
We are certainly vulnerable across the board to natural and man-made threats to our electrical grid system that could render it unrepairable in our lifetime.
Hall tells CBN News that he's especially concerned about an electronic magnetic pulse, or EMP, attack against the grid.
It entails simply one small nuclear weapon being detonated above the central part of the United States over Nebraska, Kansas area would put out create a pulse from coast to coast and border to border that would totally annihilate our electric system.
There's really no excuse for the country to be vulnerable to EMP.
Dr. Peter Pry, a former CIA intelligence officer, sits on the Department of Homeland Security's EMP task force. He's out with a report this week concluding that North Korea is now in possession of EMP weapons so strong that no electric grid could survive from such an attack.
North Korea almost certainly has developed super EMP weapons. These are nuclear weapons that are specialized to produce extraordinarily powerful electromagnetic pulse effects, and it would make it, along with Russia and China, one of the few nations in the world that has these weapons.
San Antonio, Texas is now leading the nation's efforts to defend against such electromagnetic threats. In collaboration with the Air Force's Joint Base San Antonio, retired Brigadier General Guy Walsh, along with teams of researchers, scientists, and security experts, are studying grid vulnerabilities and deploying measures to protect them from getting fried. For obvious security reasons, Walsh won't divulge specifics, but says their goal is
to really look across the board at training, at education, and the technologies that are going to help make the electrical grid both resilient to attack, but able to recover more quickly.
Meanwhile, grid operators in some regions of the country are also heeding warnings to prepare for solar storms and sunspots blasting particles into space called coronal mass ejections. William Murtaugh's group at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, maintains a direct line with all the electric companies in the event of a geomagnetic eruption.
When we see one of these large eruptions occurring on the sun and what we call a coronal mass ejection coming towards Earth, we initiate this hotline call and we make communication with essentially the entire grid, owners and operators across the nation.
Researchers with the U.S. Geological Survey released this map last year showing grid systems in the Midwest and Eastern Seaboard that are particularly vulnerable to solar storms. Murtaugh says electricity operators are now constantly assessing areas of vulnerability.
If there's vulnerability to certain equipment, maybe they can modify that equipment, the manufacturing of that equipment, to make it hardened, to make it better protected against the geomagnetic storm. There are many different actions they can take to ensure that the grid stays up and running during these big geomagnetic storms.
Still, the big challenge is that many of America's electricity systems weren't designed or built with the thought of being protected against cyber threats or EMP attacks.
The systems themselves are very antiquated. They're very old. Security is very difficult to do on these types of devices. And we've seen in prior attacks where Russia has infiltrated our power grid from a military preparedness perspective, which means in the event that there is a conflict, could Russia impact our grid?
Former NSA hacker David Kennedy tells CBN News that only a few of them are even prepared to handle today's level of hacking sophistication, especially those attacks coming from China.
China is very pressing because they have a very long-term view. They're very focused on intellectual property theft, as well as their military capabilities from a cyber warfare perspective. I mean, they're handing it to us here in the United States from a cyber warfare perspective, and they're definitely scary.
The energy industry is the third most targeted sector for cyber criminals, behind only finance and manufacturing. And according to the Energy Department, hackers have the capability to shut down America's power grid.
There are very malign actors who are trying, even as we speak. There are thousands of attacks on all aspects of the energy sector and the private sector generally.
Studies about costs run the gamut from more than $25 billion a year to protect the grid to as much as $7 trillion to upgrade and modernize the whole system. A new survey this week from the nonpartisan group Protect Our Power found a majority of people support more federal funding to secure our nation's electric grid ahead of potential catastrophe.
It so often is the case when we face challenges or threats on the horizon, we're better off dealing with it before it hits as opposed to after it hits.
George Thomas, CBN News.
We're looking at something that's right around the corner, folks. And, you know, we're talking about a Green New Deal that might take $8, $9, $10 trillion to take everything away from fossil fuels and go green. That has nothing to do with what we're facing now. Well, I asked our staff to find out what it might cost to protect the grid, to get it set. One study pointed out part of it is the first line, quote, the prospective cost and benefits of protecting the U.S. electric grid for an EMP have been largely missing from public discourse. The study goes on to put the cost for necessary protection, get this, $25 billion a year. Just $25 billion. That's for both solar storms and a potential nuclear detonation. And most of that goes to the huge generation plants. And get this, it will come at an annual cost of $79 per year per capita, less than $80 a person, to avoid trillions in damages and the destruction of the entire American economy. That's all it'll take. But don't you wish that somebody in Washington would say, $25 billion is chicken feed compared to the trillions they're spending. But that, ladies and gentlemen, it is at hand. And with the sunspot activity going on, a solar mass ejection is highly possible. And don't think the North Koreans won't use what they've got. One low-yield nuclear explosion over the Midwest fries our entire electric grid. Oh, man. I don't mean to scare people, but it's real. I mean, we've really got to deal with it. Well, in other news, President Biden killed the Keystone Pipeline, which would have helped America. So why is he backing a Russian pipeline that will hurt America? Ephraim Graham has more.
Pat, the corporation behind the Keystone XL pipeline is shutting down for good. This comes after Canadian officials failed to convince President Joe Biden to keep it alive. Biden canceled a key permit for the 1,200-mile pipeline on his first day in office, citing climate change. The move cost thousands of U.S. construction jobs and will impact the nation's oil and gas production. The pipeline was projected to deliver 35 million gallons of Canadian crude to Nebraska every day upon its completion. Meanwhile, House Republicans are criticizing the president for supporting a Russia-backed natural gas pipeline in Europe. The president lifted sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Germany to Russia. House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and others call that a gift to Russian President Vladimir Putin as it hurts American economic and political influence in Europe. McCarthy also called the president's support for Nord Stream 2 baffling in light of his opposition to the Keystone project. Pat?
You know, the thing of it is, if you want to protect your environment, you don't want to send oil around in rail cars. And that oil is going to come out of Canada. And so where's it going to go? Well, you guessed it, it's going to wind up going to China. Why would we do that? Take away union jobs and kill the Keystone, and the people back in Keystone say, we've had enough, we're going forward, we're going to cancel the project. It's horrible to contemplate that we would give Russia, a boost, and at the same time kill something that would help America. Ephraim?
Pat, energy and agriculture in the Southwest are suffering as the water supply in a major reservoir is dwindling. Lake Mead provides water for 40 million people in 7 states across the Southwest and California. Over the past 2 decades, the water level dropped by 130 feet. It's now down to 37% capacity and will reach its all-time record low today. The shortage affecting farmers who can't plant crops, as well as hydroelectric power from the Hoover Dam, forcing a nearly 25% cut in output. Turning now to politics and the race for governor right here in Virginia. Democrat Terry McAuliffe, a former governor, is facing Republican Glenn Youngkin. As senior Washington correspondent Tara Mergener shows us, the election could signal where voters stand after the bitter 2020 presidential race.
Most analysts agree Democrats have the advantage going into this race with the state's left-leaning trend, but they also say Republicans may benefit from the political climate, with the race considered to be a bellwether of things to come. Beating out 4 other candidates who argue the party needs new blood, former governor and longtime Democratic fixture Terry McAuliffe will take on Republican businessman Glenn Youngkin in the November general election.
I've said we've got to go big, we've got to be bold, and we need seasoned leadership to move us forward and to lift up all Virginians.
The 64-year-old, who was Virginia's governor from 2014 to 2018, capturing more than 60% of the vote. During the campaign, touting his record, which includes expanding voting rights for felons.
This was remnants of Jim Crow, and it needed to end.
Youngkin, the GOP's newly minted nominee, says he's confident he will beat McAuliffe to become the first Republican in 12 years to win a statewide race.
So many Virginians recognize that what Terry McAuliffe stands for, which is the left liberal progressive agenda.
Youngkin, a businessman who has never held public office, is pro-life and pro-guns and believes he'll benefit from a political climate similar to the one that helped Republican Bob McDonnell win the governorship under Obama in 2009.
We see our economy and job market in a state of chaos. We see our schools in a state of chaos.
The race is expected to be a tight one, many analysts seeing it as a test for both parties ahead of next year's midterms, when Republicans try to capture control of Congress.
Before we look at the midterms, I think we should look not far from D.C. and Virginia, where you are probably going to see a very, very tight gubernatorial election in a swing state that has trended much more blue in recent years.
In addition to the traditional battles that will play out on the campaign trail, pundits also say this race is a culture war happening in Virginia and other places around the country, a test of where voters stand on social issues like critical race theory and gender policy. In Washington, I'm Tara Mergener, CBN News.
McAuliffe and Youngkin in Virginia will be a race to watch. Pat?
Well, we'll keep our eyes on Virginia, where we live, and I'm amazed at what's happened, but I think it's going to shift. And I do think the Democrats are racing as fast as they can to put in a series of socialist policies, because they know without question, with the redistricting and the new census and all the other stuff that's going on, plus Democrat retirements, the chance of the Republicans winning back the control of the House of Representatives is, it's a done deal. assuming everybody goes to the poll and votes. But we're talking about this fall's election. And once that happens, Nancy Pelosi is no longer the speaker, and some of the ultra-liberal things that are being proposed will no longer be on the table. So they are rushing as fast as they can to push through a socialist agenda before the electorate shifts and Nancy Pelosi is no longer the leader, and the House will no longer be in the hands of the Democrats. That's what's coming up, so keep your eyes on it, but it's a big thing coming up. And when you look at the current vice president, the mess that she made down in South America, and her interview with Lester Holt of NBC was just unbelievable. And, you know, you wonder if Biden goes, then we have Kamala Harris as the new president. And if she goes, then you've got Nancy Pelosi as the next candidate. So, I mean, that's the succession, is president, vice president, and speaker of the House.
Yeah, so vote. Seriously.
I mean, it's very, very important to register and to vote. But those in Virginia, just keep in mind that they've set the table now of who the candidates are. The election comes up in November.